Hello everyone and welcome to CG webinar number 343. I'm Elisa Brewis, Research Associate at the Centre for Global Higher Education at the University of Oxford, although today I'm joining you from London. And today we will be hearing from Johanna Witte and Rita Locatelli on the contribution of higher education to global ecology and the common good. Today's webinar is actually the third webinar in a four-part series, which showcases book chapters from a recent open access book entitled Assessing the Contributions of Higher Education, Knowledge for a Disordered World. We will post the link to the book in the chat. Now, in the first two webinars last week, speakers discussed the politics of reform, as well as the contribution of higher education to society, to public policy, and to global science. In the final webinar on Thursday this week, we will hear about the contribution of higher education to national culture and regional leadership. But now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce the two speakers for today's session and the topics that they will discuss. So firstly, Johanna Witte is Senior Researcher at the Bavarian State Institute for Higher Education Research and Planning in Munich, Germany. Her research is on the change of higher education systems in international perspective, higher education policy and governance, curriculum reform, and academic careers. Quite a range there. She will discuss her book chapter entitled Higher Education Science and the Climate Crisis. Our second presenter today is Rita Locatelli. She is a researcher in general and social pedagogy at the Faculty of Education of the Universita Cattolica del Sacro Cuore, where she collaborates with the UNESCO Chair in Education for Human Development and Solidarity Among Peoples. Rita's research centers on education policies in relation to development and international cooperation, with a particular focus on inclusion, participatory processes in education, and democratic governance and citizenship, also at the higher education level. Rita will discuss her book chapter, co-authored with Simon Marginson, entitled UNESCO's Common Good Idea of Higher Education and Democracy. So we have two hugely important topics that we are going to tackle today by two fantastic speakers. Welcome, everyone. I will now pass over to Johanna Witte, our first presenter today, to begin today's webinar. Please go ahead, Johanna.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, first of all, I would like to thank Simon Marginson for giving me the opportunity to present in this webinar series. So why a contribution on universities, science and the climate crisis? This webinar series and the underlying book highlight the many contributions of higher education and make the point that they reach far beyond the individual economic benefits. Universities and science contribute through research, education, and transfer, including public engagement and public debate. These contributions are social, political, and cultural, individual and collective, national and global. I argue that given the immense civilizational challenge posed by the climate crisis, higher education and science have to make a meta contribution beyond all this. They have to help society to transform itself, such as to be able to live within the natural boundaries of our ecosystem, the Earth. As the German science historian Jürgen Renn put it, historically, science was a rather marginal activity of human societies. Today, the future of humankind depends also on its insights and offers for solutions. The quote, which is from his book with the programmatic subtitle, Rethinking Science for the Anthropocene, highlights the immense responsibility and potential of our sector in relation to the climate crisis. In this presentation, I ask, which contributions higher education and science already make to addressing climate change, why it is so difficult for the sector to live up to its potential, and what else needs to be done. Most of all, I would like to use this great opportunity to be in touch with with such a diverse international audience to hear your views and ideas and engage in discussion about the topic, and to relate the debate about climate change to the discussion about higher education and the public good that Rita Locatelli will bring to us right after my presentation. The themes are complementary and important to see in conjunction. But let me first take a step back and look at the challenges posed by the climate situation.
Sorry, Johanna.
Yeah?
In the next part of the presentation, do you wish to share some slides?
Oh, sorry. I thought that I shared my screen and I didn't. Why didn't you say that immediately?
Sorry.
Sorry. I wasn't aware of the fact that I didn't share my slides. Sorry. So these were actually my slides. Okay.
Thank you. We can see
Does
that
it work now? Okay, good. So I think that the urgency of the climate crisis is evident to everyone in this session. According to the 6th IPCC assessment report, the physical science basis from 2021, the Paris target of limiting temperature rise to 1.5 to 2 degrees will most likely not be kept. Climate change will most probably become uncontrollable by humankind through self-reinforcing feedback loops. We have already passed the boundaries that mark a safe operating space for humanity in 3 out of 9 planetary subsystems: biodiversity, the nitrogen cycle, and climate change. This means that the discussion is no more about mitigation versus adaptation. We have to do both, to adapt to the climate change that already takes place and prevent further climate change at the same time. Geologists have coined the term Anthropocene for the epoch we are in to highlight how decisive and irreversible human impact upon the eco-geological development of the Earth has become. This impact was enabled by scientific progress in conjunction with the economic system. So higher education and science have to make a meta contribution. A hugely transformative task lies ahead, which is more than a contribution to the functioning of the system, namely to lead an encompassing transformation in production and consumption patterns and enable and foster a change of behaviors and attitudes. To understand what makes it so difficult for higher education and science to fully play this transformational role, some theoretical considerations. The first one is to consider that both stable world climate and world science are global or collective common goods. Sharing this quality with world climate, global science is in a pivotal position to speak truth to power and overcome the boundaries of limited individual and national self-interest. Climate change is thus an area where the potential of global science to function as a world mind, as put by Simon Marginson, is much needed. But it is also prone to undersupply and threatened by nationalization, political conflict, and exclusive forms of competition. Awareness of the social embeddedness of higher education also helps to understand the genus-faced role of higher education and science. It is both part of the problem and of the solution. Universities have an ambiguous role. They help tackling the climate crisis, but they also contribute to it. They are themselves subsystems of the very society that is trapped in the social and economic acceleration mechanisms that have produced the climate crisis. It is difficult for science and higher education to fulfill their roles as correctives of these developments, as they are themselves victims of the same mechanisms, such as, for example, efficiency pressures, widespread precariousness of academic careers, pressures towards closer labor market coupling of programs, etc. And not least, universities contribute to global warming by producing emissions. Critical self-examination is thus part of higher education's adequate response to the climate crisis, especially when acting as change agents, and a prerequisite for contributing more to the solution than to the problem. As higher education and science as a sector are largely dependent on public funding, safeguarding functional autonomy in the governance of these resources is another prerequisite. Here I can only give you an overview of what I tease out in my chapter in more detail. The range of contributions in higher education and science in relation to the climate crisis in the fields of research, education, third mission and public debate, consumption and campus management, and the roles of different actors in making these contributions, as well as the many issues, developments, and challenges in these areas. Many issues can be raised in each of these fields, and each would deserve a session of its own. Maybe we can come back to them in the discussion, as time is too short here. To name some of the important issues, under third mission and public debate, the relation of science and the civil society, which is changing with the Fridays for Future movement as an example. Under consumption and campus management, the climate footprint of research and study related travel, on which Robin Shields has written an instructive paper. Under the education function, the challenge of implementing the Sustainable Development Goals and transformative teaching and learning, which has an entire literature strand and movement of its own. Under actors' roles, the role of rankings, such as the CGHE ranking of top universities for climate action, as an indicator of the increasing relevance of climate policy and action for the higher education sector. So I pick out one of those fields now in an exemplary way, that is science and research. They make three major contributions towards tackling the climate crisis through scientific assessment, that is measuring and understanding climate change, and thus providing the empirical basis for policy decisions and political action. Mitigation, that is climate-friendly technology development and economic and social models that allow humankind to limit global climate change to bearable levels. Adaptation, that is coping strategies and dealing with the damage and loss that comes along with climate change. There is an important channel through which global climate science feeds their results into the policy process, the IPCC, that is the International Panel on Climate Change, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, created to provide policymakers with regular scientific assessments on climate change, its implications and potential future risks. This in turn informs the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and is translated into multilateral agreements on climate protection, such as the 2015 Paris Agreement. Potentially, the meta-studies emerging from these working groups play the role of awakening calls towards humankind, making important contributions to creating and feeding a world public sphere, as coined by Marginson. However, how these findings are publicly received, how they translate into international agreements and ultimately international policies is far from trivial and far from satisfactory. Climate science is heavily underfunded. According to a study by Overland and Sovakol, only 2.4 to 4.6% of competitive research funding in the OECD was spent on research on climate change between 1990 and 2018. Out of this small percentage, only about 10% went to the social sciences and only about 5% into social science research on mitigation. That is research on how we actually can adapt behavior and how societies can change. That is only 0.1% of all competitive research funding in the OECD went into social science research on how to mitigate the climate crisis. So funding on climate science still seems to work on the presumption that it is a technical, not a social challenge. If we look at funding by country, we found funding for climate science is largely national, not multilateral, with the UK at the top, followed by the US, Germany, France, Spain, the Netherlands, and Italy. The European Commission is the only multilateral funding body that contributes at the level of nations, so at a comparable level. Given that climate change is a global challenge, this raises questions. To conclude, I would like to highlight a couple of challenges ahead to the global higher education and science sector, also as points for our ensuing discussion. Higher education and science's own climate footprint is still largely a black spot, which institutions need to address, also for the sake of their own credibility. Documentation of this footprint is still scattered and unsystematic, and in fact rare. We lack a consistent methodology for the calculations of climate gas emissions of universities and science organizations, and very few institutions are climate neutral yet. In Germany, there's one institution, that's the Leuphana University, Lüneburg, which is. The initiative Race to Zero, Universities and Colleges, a subsection of the UNFCCC's Global Race to Zero initiative, is an important start. We need more widespread participation of the sector in it. Second, we need to radically strengthen the transformative and creative functions of higher education. Universities have an expressive function, as put by McCohen. They are micro-societies in themselves, and they can lead as examples for students and as part of the fulfillment of their third mission. They are also examples for society. Academic freedom is under attack in many systems. It needs to be defended. To be truly transformative, higher education and research need more, not less, functional autonomy from the political and economic system, while ensuring a sufficient level of public funding. Third, we need to reconsider the relationship between science and the politics of climate change. This concerns the way the UNFCCC-IPCC linkage, the national, is translated into national policies. How the national level interaction of science and politics on climate issues is played out, and the self-image of the sector vis-à-vis the public sphere, which is very much governed by the ethos of neutrality of science. There is a need for more encompassing, not just individual responsibility of higher education and science for the outcomes of their research. And what we find so far are many initiatives of individual researchers, but fewer initiatives of entire institutions. Finally, we need to strengthen global science and the global higher education and science community and counteract isolationism wherever possible. We need to join hands for international climate action. This includes mapping exercises of universities on climate-related activities beyond ranking competition. Thank you very much. I would like to come back on these challenges and discuss them with you in the discussion, but first it's Rita's turn now.
Thank you very much, Johanna. Some really important discussion questions there. My goodness, some very big, big questions to try and answer. So thank you. And you've ended on that important point about how do we create global solidarity. So at this point, it's my great pleasure to introduce our second speaker, Rita Locatelli. So please go ahead and start sharing your slides if you have some slides to share. And we're ready to listen to your presentation, Rita.
All right, thank you very much, Elisa, and it was a great pleasure to hear Johanna's presentation. And I also see many connections with her chapter, actually, also regarding the origins of the concept of commons and common goods. So I'm glad that we ended up in the same webinar. And I also wish to thank the Center for Global Higher Education and all the editors of this volume that we have the pleasure to contribute to. So I'm very glad to present the chapter that I've drafted with Simon Marginson, which deals with the UNESCO's common good idea of higher education and democracy. And I would really like to highlight this term democracy, which is really at the basis of this, let's say, alternative framework that we would like to suggest as a normative principle guiding the politics of higher education and the organization of higher education systems in general. So first of all, our chapter first recalls the themes discussed in the previous parts of the volume, and which highlight the fact that higher education produces and provides the conditions for the production of a broad range of social, economic, cultural, and political outcomes. At the same time, we highlight the fact that social science somehow struggles to theorize and observe this complex empirical terrain, in part because social science tends to fixate on the ways of seeing that are used by nation state and which are for most part based on capitalist economy rather than larger entities such as society. And it also because it is difficult to comprehend something as diffuse and as multiple as the outcomes generated by higher education, which connect to many agents with different perspectives and are constantly changing. So these are our first ideas. And then we recall a useful distinction, which is made in the second chapter on the distinction between individual and collective goods. And we highlight the fact that the framework of individual goods has raised most of the attention in neoliberal policy settings. And also the fact that somehow the public-private distinction does not appear to be sufficient to explain higher education. So while recalling the distinction that Simon Marginson made in his previous work regarding the combination of individual and collective outcomes with a more geospatial scale regarding local and global, we see actually that the way higher education is framed does not really hold in this complex scenario. This is because higher education provides combined conditions in which individual students for themselves and in turn they contribute to the formation of society and which entail multiple and reciprocal permutations of the self and of the collective. And that is why actually we see that the very concept of higher education as a public good, which is mostly being used in literature on higher education, is somehow called into question by several trends in the higher education landscape. We see that we see very high level of massification of higher education, which has, however, put pressures on the public finances. And the states have responded to these pressures in several ways, but we highlight some of them specifically. Some of them relate to the partial shift of costs from government to households. And we have seen that households in OECD countries are the source of 3/4 of private expenditure on tertiary institutions in these countries. Or they actually have responded to this trend, to the massification of higher education by privatizing institutional provision. And we have seen that much of the growth in higher education has been and continues to be in the private sector since in 2015, more than 30% of students were enrolled in private higher education institutions worldwide. And so the idea is that in the face of this complex scenario and this where stratification is becoming more and more evident, unless egalitarian government policies are put in place, the hierarchical structure of educational provision and the social hierarchy, which follows, of course, this educational stratification, tend to reinforce and reproduce each other. high participation systems, as Marginson put in his previous volume, of higher education increasingly come to resemble society as a whole. So there is a very deep interconnection between the stratification produced by education and the social hierarchization of society as a whole. And that means that pursuing higher education as a public good would imply an ambition to make the sector non-excludable and non-rivalrous, that is universal in access. However, this is, while it has somehow been achieved in some countries, at least at the primary and secondary level, this has not been achieved in higher education. And the emphasis at this level have been put on private benefits functions, seen as a component of the capitalist knowledge economy, in which the expansion of markets is seen as the precondition of economic competitiveness and prosperity. Regarding these challenges in the sector, in the higher education sector, somehow UNESCO, for more than 2 decades, has tried to problematize these issues and have sustained an evolving discourse about higher education as a public good. And that is why UNESCO's concern and priorities for higher education sector were very worried about the commodification as enshrined in the WTO and GATS agreements. And there was a need to ensure, there has been a need to ensure more public responsibility in the sector, while at the same time ensuring quality and inclusion. In terms of discourse of UNESCO with regard to the principle of education as a public good, we see that the discussion is less framed on questions of state delivery and ownership, but the attention is put more on funding and on purposes of higher education institutions. And we have analyzed several UNESCO policy documents on communiques between the last 20 years. But at the same time, we have seen that UNESCO, following a period of internal discussion, UNESCO developed a new perspective on the public good problem. And so we would like to foreshadow UNESCO's subsequent development of the idea of higher education, not as a public, but also as a global common good. And this pamphlet, published in 2015, which is actually echoed in the most recent publication released by UNESCO in 2021, Reimagining Our Futures Together, a new social contract for education, actually sees the principle of education as a common good as one of the principles guiding the governance of the new social contract for education. And UNESCO arrived to this proposition of the concept of education as common good in light of the nature and degree of private engagement in educational provision, which increasingly blurred the boundaries between what was public and what was private, and what is public and private in education. The idea is really to go beyond the category of public goods as it is framed in economic theory, and to somehow create a new category of common goods. If we go to the origin of this concept, actually, we see that the very initial concept of the common goods can be traced back to Roman law, which designated certain things as common, such as running water, air, the sea, and its shores. And these things were common by nature, actually. So that is why I see some connections with what Johanna has just said before. And this framework has been developed even more by Elinor Ostrom, Nobel Prize in 1990, where she defined economic theory in, where she defined the commons in economic theory, not defined as some goods that are non-excludable but rivalrous or subtractable, like irrigation system, fishing grounds. But more generally, we can see that the category has expanded to include a broader category of goods. And this category has been identified in opposition to the dynamics of neoliberalism. These goods can be seen as a reaction to the recomposition of networks of solidarity and cooperation within communities. And it very much speaks in terms of developing instruments of participatory democracy. So somehow this category represents an evolution, a standalone category grounded not only in economic theory, but beyond economic theory, calling into questions also more philosophical and political conceptions. So that is why I think that the common goods exceed the more instrumental concept of public goods, because unlike public goods, which can be enjoyed as individual goods, like I can enjoy from education on my own, but at the same time, the idea of the common goods highlight the fact that I can only benefit from education if we are in a collective process. The very essence of education is within a shared collective endeavor. And these goods at the same time require forms of collectivity and shared governance, both for their production and enjoyment. These goods are grounded in the cultural and social dimensions of the community, so that's why they can be applied in different ideological and political terrain, unless there is a quest for real democracy in any case, and they are identified for their contribution to the general interest. And as Simon Martins also highlighted, the concept of common goods at the micro level is related to the macro level idea of the common good, which is understood in terms of social solidarity, social relations, and based on universal human rights and equality of respect. That is why this concept presupposes a certain degree of democratization. Of course, this framework entails the turn to common goods implies a larger role for civil society and a continuing role for the state in regulating access and quality in the private sector. We can say that UNESCO's move constitutes a balancing act with an inherent ambiguity. However, it is more difficult, of course, to guarantee equality of opportunity in this framework than one based on state provision, especially as the state willingness to regulate non-government sector tends to vary from country to country. And on the other hand, the common good framework offers a new basis for social responsibility among private actors and a grassroots system for monitoring their embeddedness in shared projects. Its flexibility also enables collective values to be pursued in a range of different societies with varying approaches to the role of the state. That is, however, also highlighted in this following slide. Indeed, this framework transcends the problem inherent to the zero-sum public good framework, which entails the idea that there is a zero-sum exactly result from the public-private good discussion. And this framework is also more consistent with the organization of higher education institutions in not highly marketized society, because the idea of the common good, which is based on active community, resonates with the traditional, for example, collectivism and shared communal values, for example, of Chinese society. And we see that this concept has been widely applied to this level of education in this society as well. And more generally, the concept of higher education as a common good strengthens participatory and deliberative processes in higher education. It emphasizes the intrinsic and societal value of higher education institutions, while also calling into question the utilitarian model of higher education seen as an individual socioeconomic investment. And it also favors a humanistic approach, highlighting the relational dimension of each education process, highlighting the purpose of higher education institutions, which is exactly that of extending human understanding through the three functions of teaching, research, and community engagement. And we see that this framework speaks differently for each of these functions, which are the pillars of higher education institutions. So the idea is that the foregoing argument suggests that the practical task in higher education is to develop new approaches that strengthen participatory and deliberative processes and sustainable and equitable institutions, while highlighting the relational dimensions, seeing learning as a shared endeavor and responsibility. Higher education as a common good offers a way out of current limitations. Because universities are embedded in a global economy of knowledge and are shaped by its inequalities. yet they are also in a privileged position to question imbalances of power in the governance of knowledge and to counteract to knowledge commercialization. And we have seen that during the pandemic, there has been greater attention to the interconnectedness of societies and the fact that such global challenges can be promptly addressed only through cooperation. And there is therefore at the end of our chapter a call for a new societal educational pact, which is somehow highlighted also in the most recent UNESCO publication on the futures of education. And we end up this chapter by saying that the pandemic has emphasized the fragility of higher education in those countries, especially where the market imaginary is uppermost. Therefore, they have proven more fragile in this context than the public good system during the pandemic. Having said this, the concept of higher education as a common good allows, it matches collective outcomes with collective agency. It also presupposes a different model of interaction among universities, moving beyond a narrow competitive perspective, which is not called into question in the public good framework. So the idea is that public funding and regulation remain necessary to promote equity, of course, but this alone is not enough to counteract existing inequalities in higher education. A new approach and model should be developed, which allows universities to be truly engaged in civic and social life. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Rita. Thank you to both our presenters for sticking to the agreed time limit as well. So we now have a nice, good chunk of time available to discuss these contributions we've heard today. So just a reminder about the protocol of the webinars to all the audience members today. Please, you can type your question into the chat and then I will invite you to present a question. You can turn your video on, introduce yourself, so we can make it more like a dialogue. While we wait for the first question to be presented, I have one question. I think I can manage to make it relevant to Johanna's presentation and to Rita's presentation as well. My question is in the role of students or student unions in both of these processes you described. So in Johanna's case, in institution or scaling up the impact of university actions in adapting and mitigating towards the climate crisis, and in the case of Rita, in your common good vision of this participatory process of learning and research and community service. Johanna, would you like to answer first?
Yeah, well, I think the main form in which we have seen the role of students highlighted is the Fridays for Futures movement, which has actually swapped over to universities. So we have also scientists for future and the students for future, which actually link up with the school movement. So the school and the student movements, they merge into one, at least in Germany. Otherwise, I think we haven't seen such an active role, because in my framework, I must admit, you made me think, yeah, it's rather the idea that through the education function, universities can actually transform students to equip them for all those challenges and make them aware of the climate crisis, and equip them with all the knowledge they need to tackle it. But there, of course, it's a collaborative educational process, but it's kind of steered by the universities rather than the students. But with the Students for Future, Fridays for Future movement, students have themselves kind of started steering the process.
Thank you.
Rita?
That's a great example there. And I wonder if people in the audience want to bring in their examples of how this movement has played out in their own country context as well. Rita, would you like to add something now?
Yes, for sure. Well, thanks, Elisa, for the question, because I think it's a very interesting one. If we look at the framework of higher education as a common good, and we stick to this level of education. I think that, as you were mentioning, Elisa, the participation of student unions is essential at the higher education level, because we see that higher education as a common good implies the fact that higher education is the result of the interaction of the different components of society. And student unions are one particular stakeholder, let's say, at this level of education. And I think that student unions can be involved in different ways also with regard to the three main functions of university regarding teaching, research, and public engagement. In different forms, of course, their role is essential in shaping the way research is conducted, the way teaching is organized, and the way research and teaching as well are mutually exchanging themselves. And at the same time, how public engagement, what's being called the third mission, which, however, should be not really the third in terms of importance, becoming the more and more connection of an higher education institution to the landscape where it's based. So I think student unions should at least really reinforce this process of grounding higher education institutions to the very context where it is based, actually. Thanks for the question.
Thank you very much. I would like to bring in Jonah Otto at this point. I believe his question is directed to Rita. It is about buy-in from governments and states. But Johanna also talked about the Janus, the two faces, universities being part of the problem and solution, and then the tension with the relationship between universities and society. Do they stay politically neutral, or do they become more proactive? So perhaps I will allow Rita to answer Jonah's question first, but I will also invite Johanna to add her comments as well. So Jonah, can you please turn your video on and unmute yourself? And hello, welcome to the webinar.
Hi, thank you so much for taking my question. Yes, I think it's the heart of the question is getting at this tension in specific contexts where the financial control might not be completely aligned with a reorientation towards a common good perspective in attempting to achieve the missions. Perhaps then the better question is, in what way can individual institutions work to then do this if they don't have national or governmental level support? Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for this, Jonah, for this interesting question. And I think this is the very heart, as you were saying, of this challenging, actually. I think there is a space for individual, it really depends on context, first of all. So there are many organizations of systems organization of higher education institutions all over the world, and it really depends on how control is organized and exerted at different levels. So I think the Italian landscape is quite different from the UK landscape, from the USA landscape, and from Asian one as well. If there is a room, in any case, for flexibility and for independent, let's say, policy intervention also on the side of the individual institution, there can be room for change. I think, for example, on some Latin American experiences on intercultural universities, where they represent the quite innovative experiences of integrating more indigenous knowledge into the curriculum and so on. And they somehow can be seen in, they are not in the established framework, national framework of higher education institutions, publicly funded, provided, and so on. But they nevertheless represent an idea of making the communities participating and try to collect funding, actually, by, if not by public funding, by different kinds of alternative sources of funding. And they are increasingly recognized in the system. So they have not started within the sector as an expression of the public higher education institution, for example, in Mexico, but they have increasingly been integrated in the system. So this is the idea that even some small experiences which start as very specific context-driven responses, they can be step by step somehow integrated in the more general landscape. So I think there is some room. And another aspect I think that should be brought into the discussion relates to the global governance of higher education institutions, which can either facilitate or hinder the realization of such more cooperative model, which doesn't really want to exploit on the competition side of this model, but rather on the cooperation side as well. So thank you, it's a very good question. Thank you, Johanna.
Yeah, Elisa, you invited me to respond as well, but I would propose to respond jointly with Magdalena's question, because that actually links in very nicely. So if Magdalena could ask a question first, then I could come in and
yes,
answer
let's
jointly.
do that. So please, Magdalena, can you turn your video on, and welcome to the webinar.
Thank you very much. Thanks to Johanna, Rita, Elisa, super interesting. I'm in your let's say in your area of research and so on. So since Johanna said that she wanted to go back to this slide with challenges and so on, my question is very simple, because and it's very difficult to answer, I think, you know, not only here but in the future. So you've been studying this from a climate change point of view and from common good. And what should universities do to encourage sustainability at two levels here? Because the third level would be partners, but I'm thinking in the sense of the book, see, in the operational level, and also in the teaching and research level, because everything has to do with internal stakeholders, and sometimes we see that there's a disbalance in these two, in these three areas. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. It's a very encompassing question, because they can actually do a lot. And linking to the previous question, I think depending on context, of course, institutions have a different degree of leeway, right, to unfold their own policies and practices. But I think there's always something that can be done. And then it depends also which actor you are. If you say universities, right? The university is not a person. I would now speak from the perspective of university heads, but of course, also an individual academic can always do something. So I start with university heads. I mean, if they really take this on board, then they can, of course, with their university, develop an encompassing strategic plan for how to become a climate aware and climate friendly institution, and then mainstream it into all activities, including, for example, their research profile, the curriculum development, if there are curriculum frameworks, you know, then the third mission, the public debate, and then very importantly also the campus operations, what I said, leading by example, really do what you preach, implement it in all aspects of campus operations. I mean, already very small things like the canteen menus are very educational for students who go there and eat every day. And if they see that, you know, what kind of food could also work for them, then it's something they take home for their lives. Yeah, universities can go out to the public, of course, and they can link up in rectors conferences. I mean, there's so much they can do. It's important that universities not only use this to whitewash or for marketing reasons, which we also see lately, but that they really take it on board. And of course, if you found a new university, is a big opportunity to integrate it into the building, from the, you know, to build a carbon neutral university. It's more difficult if you have a campus already, and even more difficult if campus facility management is maybe partly state-led, because a huge part of the footprint is also the heating, the heating and the nature of the building, which you maybe cannot change immediately, but you can start when you have the next opportunity to renew your buildings. Yeah, then there's of course also the policy on flights and travels. I mean, you can think of every aspect that you could reconsider. And if you are not a university head, but an academic, you can also do a lot. We have actually seen many initiatives, for example, pledges by academics to actually renounce on short-haul flights, not to fly if it's less than 1,000 kilometers. That's something that academics can do voluntarily. Yeah. Every academic can think where there are climate-related aspects in their teaching and in their research, and how they can bring it to students. So I could go on forever. There are many examples in my chapter, actually, and I'm sure that the other people in the audience can feed in 1,000 more examples from their experience.
Thank you. And just checking with Joan and Magdalena, do you have any follow-up questions in response to that?
No, that actually covered what I was looking for very closely.
Okay, we have about 8 minutes left, and there was a really major question you posed in that final slide, Johanna. And maybe we could tackle it now then, in the very short time we have left. It was about the self-image of universities and this tension between universities as a space for being politically neutral. But then, as you were implying, I think, is that almost can become a way for universities to shrink from their responsibility. It almost becomes an excuse for inaction. And in my own research, I heard quite senior level institutional leaders saying, our job is to produce the knowledge, that's it. And then, they sort of wash their hands. Whereas I think, can you clarify for us, what were you posing there at the end with this something like a redefining of relationship between university and society?
Yeah,
because I think, what we got the passion from your presentation, definitely. And I think you're definitely in sort of more leaning towards, universities need to take more overt political action. When I say the word political, I'm thinking of it in the way Rita's talking about a common good politics. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts.
Well, thank you for giving me the floor to unfold that. It's actually, it has many facets. I mean, what I was thinking of was a thought put forward by Jürgen Renn, the science historian I referred to, who he wrote this fat book about the history of science. And when I think it was German physicists who actually developed or contributed to developing the atomic bomb without actually wanting that, and they actually reflected upon their responsibility as researchers, as individual researchers, what comes out of their research, which is per se neutral. And he takes that on, Renn, and says, today it's no more the responsibility of individual researchers only, but of higher education and science as a sector, because scientific progress, as I have actually explained in my presentation, scientific progress has basically contributed to leading us into this climate crisis, So we cannot be neutral. We cannot be neutral. We have to assume sectoral responsibility for the outcomes. But on the other hand, I mean, this does not mean that you kind of distort research outcomes for political purposes or for political activism. So there's this balancing act, and at least for Germany, I can say that many researchers are now discussing that also in the public. It was also a big issue during the COVID pandemic, that how far can we actually interfere with the political process? And it's always a balancing act, but I think where there is something like a 98% safe scientific outcome, you know, then it doesn't endanger neutrality if you speak up to politics and tell them what should be the consequences of those findings.
Thank you. And I think that that links also with one of Rita's points she made about how political context matters and the context of the state-society relations. That's the backdrop against which this tension is happening. Yeah. Well, that was fantastic. I'm just checking if we have any other questions before we close.
Elisa,
I'd like
if I may, I just wanted to connect to what Johanna was just saying in quite different terms, but I think that the idea is very similar, because I think that the framework of education, higher education as a common good, really speaks in terms of an ecology of knowledge as well, because we know that knowledge in different parts of the world is assessed and evaluated differently. So I think that if you really want higher education institutions to contribute to a very democratic discussion on also how to tackle climate change and which kind of opportunities higher education institutions can take in advancing towards this more ecological perspective, I think that also at the same time we should also speak in terms of a democratization of knowledge system. That means giving voice to different epistemologies, and I think this is somehow enshrined in the framework of higher education as a common good. And so I just wanted to make this final link, because I think that there are many connections which are not evident, but it's good to put them out and highlight them more explicitly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rita, because that is so true. And actually, also research on climate change needs to become more of a two-way process, you know, a dialogue with civil society, because the issues come in through civil society, and science tackles them, responds to them, and there can be kind of a co-production of knowledge, particularly when it comes to, you know, mitigating climate change or adapting climate change, because it's the societies that have to adapt and that are mitigating. So it's a joint learning process there.
And also picks up on the point that you made as well, Rita, about how, you know, community engagement is often dumped at the end of the list of the duties of a university, the third mission, the other thing we do. Whereas perhaps the better way the more appropriate way to think about it is something that's embedded in everything you do. And you've both talked about social embeddedness of the university as a social institution. And definitely there's an arrogance in thinking that universities are going to solve the climate crisis as the experts who produce the technical solutions and sort of impose them on society. Yes, and there is an excellent keynote from Kerry Facer from last year's CG annual conference, who talked about this issue, and she talked a lot about empathy. And one of the tasks for universities was to develop listening skills and empathy. So if you're interested in this topic, I encourage you to go back and look at the keynote by Kerry Facer from the 2022 CG annual conference. Colleagues, in the interest of time, I'm going to close. You can see in the chat, there is a link to the next webinar in this series. And the book is open access. The link to the book is there as well, so you're free to read all the chapters of the book. Next Thursday, this week on Thursday, we will have a webinar looking at the contribution of higher education to national culture, things like museums, public spaces, art, the arts, and regional leadership. So it looks to be another fascinating webinar in this series. Thank you to all the audience members, whatever time zone or city or country in the world you joined us from. It was excellent to have you participating in the discussion today. It leaves my final task is to thank Rita and Johanna for some really passionate and thought-provoking presentations today. I hope we can all go away from today's presentation thinking we have responsibility and we can do something, as Johanna encouraged us to do. Thank you, everybody. Have a great afternoon or evening, and we hope to see you on Thursday at the next webinar. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you from my side too.